There is no need for dwelling on this period, which extends from the year 1828 to the year 1839. The winters were hard. The summer did indeed extend its beneficent influence to the islands of the Tsalo group, but the cold season, with its attendant snows, rains, and tempests, spared them none of its severity. During 7 months, Captain William Guy had not lost one of those who had come with him safe and sound out of the trap set for them at clock, and this was due, no doubt, to their robust constitutions, remarkable power of endurance, and great strength of character. Alas, misfortune was making ready to fall on them. The month of May had come. It corresponds in those regions to the month of November in northern lands, and the icepacks which the current carried towards the north were beginning to drift past Tsalo. One day, one of the 7 men failed to return to the cavern. They called, they waited, they searched for him. All was in vain. He did not reappear. No doubt he had been drowned. He was never more seen by his fellow exiles. This man was Patterson, the faithful companion of William Guy. Now, what William Guy did not know, but we told him, was that Patterson, under what circumstances none would ever learn, had been carried away on the surface of an ice block where he died of hunger. And on that ice block, which had traveled so far as Prince Edward Island, the boatswain had discovered the corpse of the unfortunate man, almost decomposed by the action of the warmer waters. When Captain Len Guy told his brother of the finding of the body of Patterson, and how it was owing to the notes in his pocketbook that the Halbrane had been enabled to proceed towards the Antarctic seas, William Guy hid his face in his hands and wept. Other misfortunes followed upon this one. 5 months after the disappearance of Patterson, in the middle of October, Tsalo Island was laid waste from coast to coast by an earthquake, which destroyed the southwestern group almost entirely. William Guy and his companions must soon have perished on the barren land, which no longer could give them food, had not the means of leaving its coast, now merely an expanse of tumbled rocks, been afforded them in an almost miraculous manner. 2 days after the earthquake, the current carried ashore within a few hundred yards of their cavern a boat which had drifted from the island group on the southwest. Without the delay of even 1 day, the boat was laden with as much of the remaining provisions as it could contain, and the 6 men embarked in it, bidding adieu forever to the now uninhabitable island. Unfortunately, a very strong breeze was blowing. It was impossible to resist it, and the boat was driven southwards by that very same current which had caused our iceberg to drift to the coast of Halbrane Land. For 2 months and a half, these poor fellows were borne across the open sea, with no control over their course. It was not until the 2nd of January in the present year, 1840, that they sighted land east of the Jane Sound. Now, we already knew this land was not more than 50 miles from Halbrane Land. Yes, so small, relatively, was the distance that separated us from those whom we had sought for in the Antarctic regions far and wide, and concerning whom we had lost hope. Their boat had gone ashore far to the southeast of us, but on how different a coast from that of Tsalo Island, or rather on one how like that of Halbrane Land. Nothing was to be seen but sand and stones, neither trees, shrubs, nor plants of any kind. Their provisions were almost exhausted. William Guy and his companions were soon reduced to extreme want, and 2 of the little company, Forbes and Sexton, died. The remaining 4 resolved not to remain a single day longer in the place where they were doomed to die of hunger. They embarked in the boat with the small supply of food still remaining, and once more abandoned themselves to the current, without having been able to verify their position, for want of instruments. Thus had they been borne upon the unknown deep for 25 days, their resources were completely exhausted, and they had not eaten for 48 hours, when the boat, with its occupants lying inanimate at the bottom of it, was sighted from Halbrane Land. The rest is already known to the reader of this strange eventful history. And now the 2 brothers were at length reunited in that remote corner of the big world, which we had dubbed Halbrane Land. Chapter 25. We were the first. 2 days later, not one of the survivors from the 2 schooners, the Jane and the Halbrane, remained upon any coast of the Antarctic region. On the 21st of February, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the boat, with us all, we numbered 13 in it, left the little creek and doubled the point of Halbrane Land. On the previous day, we had fully and finally debated the question of our departure, with the understanding that if it were settled in the affirmative, we should start without delay. The captain of the Jane was for an immediate departure, and Captain Len Guy was not opposed to it. I willingly sided with them, and West was of a similar opinion. The boatswain was inclined to oppose us. He considered it imprudent to give up a certainty for the uncertain, and he was backed by Endicott, who would in any case say ditto to his Mr. Burke. However, when the time came, Hurl eagerly conformed to the view of the majority with a good grace, and declared himself quite ready to set out, since we were all of that way of thinking. Our boat was one of those in use in the Tsalal archipelago for plying between the islands. We knew, from the narrative of Arthur Pym, that these boats are of two kinds, one resembling rafts or flat boats, the other strongly built pirogues. Our boat was of the former kind, 40 feet long, 6 feet in width, and worked by several paddles. We called our little craft the Paracuta, after a fish which abounds in these waters. A rough image of that denizen of the southern deep was cut upon the gunwale. Needless to say that the greater part of the cargo of the Halbrane was left in our cavern, fully protected from the weather, at the disposal of any shipwrecked people who might chance to be thrown on the coast of Halbrane Land. The boatswain had planted a spar on the top of this slope to attract attention. But our two schooners notwithstanding, what vessel would ever venture into such latitudes? Nota bene, we were just 13, the fatal number. Perfectly good relations subsisted among us. We had no longer to dread the rebellion of Aherne. How often we speculated upon the fate of those whom he had beguiled. At 7 o'clock, the extreme point of Halbrane Land lay 5 miles behind us, and in the evening we gradually lost sight of the heights that variated that part of the coast. I desire to lay special stress on the fact that not a single scrap of iron entered into the construction of this boat, not so much as a nail or a bolt, for that metal was entirely unknown to the Tsalal Islanders. The planks were bound together by a sort of liana, or creeping plant, and caulked with moss steeped in pitch, which was turned by contact with the sea water to a substance as hard as metal. I have nothing special to record during the week that succeeded our departure. The breeze blew steadily from the south, and we did not meet with any unfavorable current between the banks of the Jane Sound. During those first 8 days, the Paracuta, by paddling when the wind fell, had kept up the speed that was indispensable for our reaching the Pacific Ocean within a short time. The desolate aspect of the land remained the same, while the strait was already visited by floating drifts, packs of 1 to 200 feet in length, some oblong, others circular, and also by icebergs which our boat passed easily. We were made anxious, however, by the fact that these masses were proceeding towards the iceberg barrier, for would they not close the passages, which ought to be still open at this time? I shall mention here that in proportion as Dirk Peters was carried farther and farther from the places wherein no trace of his poor Pym had been found, he was more silent than ever, and no longer even answered me when I addressed him. It must not be forgotten that since our iceberg had passed beyond the South Pole, we were in the zone of eastern longitudes counted from the 0 of Greenwich to the 180th degree. All hope must therefore be abandoned of our either touching at the Falklands, or finding whaling ships in the waters of the Sandwich Islands, the South Orkneys, or South Georgia. Our voyage proceeded under unaltered conditions for 10 days. Our little craft was perfectly seaworthy. The two captains and West fully appreciated its soundness, although, as I have previously said, not a scrap of iron had a place in its construction. It had not once been necessary to repair its seams, so staunch were they. To be sure, the sea was smooth. Its long, rolling waves were hardly ruffled on their surface. On the 10th of March, with the same longitude, the observation gave 7 degrees 13' 2B9 for latitude. The speed of the Paracuta had then been 30 miles in each 24 hours. If this rate of progress could be maintained for 3 weeks, there was every chance of our finding the passes open, and being able to get round the iceberg barrier. Also that the whaling ships would not yet have left the fishing grounds. The sun was on the verge of the horizon, and the time was approaching when the Antarctic region would be shrouded in polar night. Fortunately, in reascending towards the north we were getting into waters from whence light was not yet banished. Then did we witness a phenomenon as extraordinary as any of those described by Arthur Pym. For 3 or 4 hours, sparks, accompanied by a sharp noise, shot out of our fingers' ends, our hair, and our beards. There was an electric snowstorm, with great flakes falling loosely, and the contact produced this strange luminosity. The sea rose so suddenly and tumbled about so wildly that the Paracuta was several times in danger of being swallowed up by the waves, but we got through the mystic-seeming tempest all safe and sound. Nevertheless, space was thenceforth but imperfectly lighted. Frequent mists came up and bounded our outlook to a few cable lengths. Extreme watchfulness and caution were necessary to avoid collision with the floating masses of ice, which were traveling more slowly than the Paracuta. It is also to be noted that, on the southern side, the sky was frequently lighted up by the broad and brilliant rays of the polar aurora. The temperature fell very perceptibly, and no longer rose above 23 degrees. 48 hours later, Captain Len Guy and his brother succeeded with great difficulty in taking an approximate observation, with the following results of their calculations. Latitude, 75 degrees 17 letter 2b9 south. Latitude, 118 degrees 3 letter 2b9 east. At this date, therefore, 12th March, the Paracuta was distant from the waters of the Antarctic Circle only 400 miles. During the night, a thick fog came on, with a subsidence of the breeze. This was to be regretted, for it increased the risk of collision with the floating ice. Of course, fog could not be a surprise to us, being where we were, but what did surprise us was the gradually increasing speed of our boat, although the falling of the wind ought to have lessened it. This increase of speed could not be due to the current, for we were going more quickly than it. This state of things lasted until morning, without our being able to account for what was happening, when at about 10 o'clock the mist began to disperse in the low zones. The coast on the west reappeared, a rocky coast, without a mountainous background. The Paracuta was following its line. And then, no more than a quarter of a mile away, we beheld a huge mound, reared above the plain to a height of 300 feet, with a circumference of from 200 to 300 feet. In its strange form, this great mound resembled an enormous sphinx, the body upright, the paws stretched out, crouching in the attitude of the winged monster which Grecian mythology has placed upon the way to Thebes. Was this a living animal, a gigantic monster, a mastodon 1,000 times the size of those enormous elephants of the polar seas whose remains are still found in the ice? In our frame of mind, we might have believed that it was such a creature, and believed also that the mastodon was about to hurl itself on our little craft and crush it to atoms. After a few moments of unreasoning and unreasonable fright, we recognized that the strange object was only a great mound, singularly shaped, and that the mist had just rolled off its head, leaving it to stand out and confront us. Ah, that sphinx! I remembered at sight of it that on the night when the iceberg was overturned and the Halbrane was carried away, I had dreamed of a fabulous animal of this kind, seated at the pole of the world, and from whom Edgar Poe could only wrest its secrets. But our attention was to be attracted. Our surprise, even our alarm, was evoked soon by phenomena still more strange than the mysterious earth form upon which the mist curtain had been raised so suddenly. I have said that the speed of the Paracuta was gradually increasing. Now it was excessive, that of the current remaining inferior to it. Now, of a sudden, the grapnel that had belonged to the Halbrane and was in the bow of the boat flew out of its socket as though drawn by an irresistible power, and the rope that held it was strained to breaking point. It seemed to tow us, as it grazed the surface of the water towards the shore. "What's the matter?" cried William Guy. "Cut away, boatswain, cut away," shouted West, "or we shall be dragged against the rocks." Hurlegerly hurried to the bow of the Paracuta to cut away the rope. Of a sudden the knife he held was snatched out of his hand, the rope broke, and the grapnel, like a projectile, shot off in the direction of the Sphinx. At the same moment, all the articles on board the boat that were made of iron or steel, cooking utensils, arms, and Dicot stove, our knives, which were torn from our pockets, took flight after a similar fashion in the same direction, while the boat, quickening its course, brought up against the beach. What was happening? In order to explain these inexplicable things, were we not obliged to acknowledge that we had come into the region of those wonders, which I attributed to the hallucinations of Arthur Pym? No, these were physical facts which we had just witnessed, and not imaginary phenomena. We had, however, no time for reflection, and immediately upon our landing, our attention was turned in another direction by the sight of a boat lying wrecked upon the sand. "The Halbrane's boat," cried Hurlegerly. It was indeed the boat which Hearn had stolen, and it was simply smashed to pieces. In a word, only the formless wreckage of a craft which has been flung against rocks by the sea remained. We observed immediately that all the ironwork of the boat had disappeared, down to the hinges of the rudder. Not one trace of the metal existed. What could be the meaning of this? A loud call from west brought us to a little strip of beach on the right of our stranded boat. 3 corpses lay upon the stony soil, that of Hearn, that of Martin Holt, and that of one of the Falklands men. Of the 13 who had gone with the sealing master, there remained only these 3, who had evidently been dead some days. What had become of the 10 missing men? Had their bodies been carried out to sea? We searched all along the coast, into the creeks, and between the outlying rocks, but in vain. Nothing was to be found, no traces of a camp, not even the vestiges of a landing. "Their boat," said William Guy, "must have been struck by a drifting iceberg. The rest of Hearn's companions have been drowned, and only these 3 bodies have come ashore lifeless." "But," asked the boatswain, "how is the state the boat is in to be explained?" "And especially," added West, "the disappearance of all the iron." "Indeed," said I, "it looks as though every bit had been violently torn off." Leaving the Paracuta in the charge of 2 men, we again took our way to the interior, in order to extend our search over a wider expanse. As we were approaching the huge mound, the mist cleared away, and the form stood out with greater distinctness. It was, as I have said, almost that of a sphinx, a dusky-hued sphinx, as though the matter which composed it had been oxidized by the inclemency of the polar climate. And then a possibility flashed into my mind, an hypothesis which explained these astonishing phenomena. "Ah," I exclaimed, "a lodestone, that is it, a magnet with prodigious power of attraction." I was understood, and in an instant the final catastrophe, to which Hearn and his companions were victims, was explained with terrible clearness. The Antarctic Sphinx was simply a colossal magnet. Under the influence of that magnet, the iron bands of the Halbrane's boat had been torn out and projected, as though by the action of a catapult. This was the occult force that had irresistibly attracted everything made of iron on the Paracuta, and the boat itself would have shared the fate of the Halbrane's boat had a single bit of that metal been employed in its construction. Was it, then, the proximity of the magnetic pole that produced such effects? An Antarctic Mystery. An Antarctic Mystery. At first we entertained this idea, but on reflection we rejected it. At the place where the magnetic meridians cross, the only phenomenon produced is the vertical position of the magnetic needle in 2 similar points of the terrestrial globe. This phenomenon, already proved by observations made on the spot, must be identical in the Antarctic regions. Thus, then, there did exist a magnet of prodigious intensity in the zone of attraction which we had entered. Under our eyes, one of those surprising effects which had hitherto been classed among fables was actually produced. The following appeared to me to be the true explanation. The trade winds bring a constant succession of clouds or mists in which immense quantities of electricity, not completely exhausted by storms, are stored. Hence there exists a formidable accumulation of electric fluid at the poles, and it flows towards the land in a permanent stream. From this cause come the northern and southern auroras, whose luminous splendors shine above the horizon, especially during the long polar night, and are visible even in the temperate zones when they attain their maximum of culmination. These continuous currents at the poles, which bewilder our compasses, must possess an extraordinary influence, and it would suffice that a block of iron should be subjected to their action for it to be changed into a magnet of power proportioned to the intensity of the current, to the number of turns of the electric helix, and to the square root of the diameter of the block of magnetized iron. Thus, then, the bulk of the Sphinx, which upreared its mystic form upon this outer edge of the southern lands, might be calculated by thousands of cubic yards. Now, in order that the current should circulate around it and make a magnet of it by induction, what was required? Nothing but a metallic load, whose innumerable windings through the bowels of the soil should be connected subterraneously at the base of the block. It seemed to me also that the place of this block ought to be in the magnetic axis, as a sort of gigantic calamite, from whence the imponderable fluid whose currents made an inexhaustible accumulator set up at the confines of the world, should issue. Our compass could not have enabled us to determine whether the marvel before our eyes really was at the magnetic pole of the southern regions. All I can say is that its needle staggered about, helpless and useless. And in fact, the exact location of the Antarctic Sphinx mattered little in respect of the constitution of that artificial lodestone, and the manner in which the clouds and metallic load supplied its attractive power. In this very plausible fashion, I was led to explain the phenomenon by instinct. It could not be doubted that we were in the vicinity of a magnet, which produced these terrible but strictly natural effects by its attraction. I communicated my idea to my companions, and they regarded this explanation as conclusive, in presence of the physical facts of which we were the actual witnesses. "We shall incur no risk by going to the foot of the mound, I suppose," said Captain Len Guy. "None," I replied. "There, yes, there." I could not describe the impression those 3 words made upon us. Edgar Poe would have said that they were 3 cries from the depths of the underworld. It was Dirk Peters who had spoken, and his body was stretched out in the direction of the Sphinx, as though it had been turned to iron and was attracted by the magnet. Then he sped swiftly towards the sphinx-like mound, and his companions followed him over rough ground strewn with volcanic remains of all sorts. The monster grew larger as we neared it, but lost none of its mythological shape. Alone on that vast plain, it produced a sense of awe. But this could only have been a delusion. We seemed to be drawn towards it by the force of its magnetic attraction. On arriving at the base of the mound, we found there the various articles on which the magnet had exerted its power: arms, utensils, the grapnel of the paracuta, all adhering to the sides of the monster. There also were the iron relics of the Halbrane's boat, all her utensils, arms, and fittings, even to the nails and the iron portions of the rudder. There was no possibility of regaining possession of any of these things. Even had they not adhered to the lodestone rock at too great a height to be reached, they adhered to it too closely to be detached. Hurlegerly was infuriated by the impossibility of recovering his knife, which he recognized at 50 feet above his head, and cried as he shook his clenched fist at the imperturbable monster, "Thief of a sphinx!" Of course, the things which had belonged to the Halbrane's boat and the paracutas were the only articles that adorned the mighty sides of the lonely mystic form. Never had any ship reached such a latitude of the Antarctic Sea. Hearn and his accomplices, Captain Len Guy and his companions, were the first who had trodden this point of the southern continent, and any vessel that might have approached this colossal magnet must have incurred certain destruction. Our schooner must have perished, even as its boat had been dashed into a shapeless wreck. West now reminded us that it was imprudent to prolong our stay upon this land of the Sphinx, a name to be retained. Time pressed, and a few days' delay would have entailed our wintering at the foot of the ice barrier. The order to return to the beach had just been given, when the voice of the half-breed was again heard, as he cried out, "There's there." We followed the sounds to the back of the monster's right paw, and we found Dirk Peters on his knees, with his hands stretched out before an almost naked corpse, which had been preserved intact by the cold of these regions, and was as rigid as iron. The head was bent, a white beard hung down to the waist, the nails of the feet and hands were like claws. How had this corpse been fixed to the side of the mound, at 6 feet above the ground? Across the body, held in place by its crossbelt, we saw the twisted barrel of a musket, half eaten by rust. "Pym, my poor Pym," groaned Dirk Peters. He tried to rise, that he might approach and kiss the ossified corpse, but his knees bent under him, a strangled sob seemed to rend his throat, with a terrible spasm his faithful heart broke, and the half-breed fell back dead. The story was easy to read. After their separation, the boat had carried Arthur Pym through these Antarctic regions. Like us, once he had passed beyond the South Pole, he came into the zone of the monster. And there, while his boat was swept along on the northern current, he was seized by the magnetic fluid before he could get rid of the gun which was slung over his shoulder, and hurled against the fatal lodestone sphinx of the ice realm. Now the faithful half-breed rests under the clay of the land of the Antarctic Mystery, by the side of his poor Pym, that hero whose strange adventures found a chronicler no less strange in the great American poet. Chapter 26. A Little Remnant. That same day, in the afternoon, the Paracuta departed from the coast of the land of the Sphinx, which had lain to the west of us since the 21st of February. By the death of Dirk Peters, the number of the passengers was reduced to 12. These were all who remained of the double crew of the two schooners, the first comprising 38 men, the second, 32, in all 70 souls. But let it not be forgotten that the voyage of the Halbrane had been undertaken in fulfillment of a duty to humanity, and 4 of the survivors of the Jane owed their rescue to it. And now there remains but little to tell, and that little must be related as succinctly as possible. It is unnecessary to dwell upon our return voyage, which was favored by the constancy of the currents and the wind to their northern course. The last part of the voyage was indeed accomplished amid great fatigue, suffering, and danger, but it ended in our safe deliverance from all these. The Paracuta. The Paracuta. Firstly, a few days after our departure from the land of the Sphinx, the sun set behind the western horizon to reappear no more for the whole winter. It was then in the midst of the semi-darkness of the austral night that the Paracuta pursued her monotonous course. True, the southern polar lights were frequently visible, but they were not the sun, that single orb of day which had illumined our horizons during the months of the Antarctic summer, and their capricious splendor could not replace his unchanging light. That long darkness of the poles sheds a moral and physical influence on mortals which no one can elude, a gloomy and overwhelming impression almost impossible to resist. Of all the Paracuta's passengers, the boatswain and Endicott only preserved their habitual good humor. Those two were equally insensible to the weariness and the peril of our voyage. I also except West, who was ever ready to face every eventuality, like a man who is always on the defensive. As for the two brothers Guy, their happiness in being restored to each other made them frequently oblivious of the anxieties and risks of the future. Of Hurliguerly, I cannot speak too highly. He proved himself a thoroughly good fellow, and it raised our drooping spirits to hear him repeat in his jolly voice, "We shall get to port all right, my friends, be sure of that. And if you only reckon things up, you will see that we have had more good luck than bad. Oh yes, I know there was the loss of our schooner. Poor Halbrane, carried up into the air like a balloon, then flung into the deep like an avalanche. But on the other hand, there was the iceberg which brought us to the coast, and the Tsallel boat which brought us and Captain William Guy and his 3 companions together. And don't forget the current and the breeze that have pushed us on up to now, and will keep pushing us on, I'm sure of that. With so many trumps in our hand, we cannot possibly lose the game. The only thing to be regretted is that we shall have to get ashore again in Australia or New Zealand, instead of casting anchor at the Kerguelens, near the quay of Christmas Harbour, in front of the Green Cormorant. For a week we pursued our course without deviation to east or west, and it was not until the 21st of March that the Paracuta lost sight of Halbrane Land, being carried towards the north by the current, while the coastline of the continent, for such we are convinced it is, trended in a round curve to the northeast. Although the waters of this portion of sea were still open, they carried a flotilla of icebergs or ice fields. Hence arose serious difficulties and also dangers to navigation in the midst of the gloomy mists, when we had to maneuver between these moving masses, either to find passage or to prevent our little craft from being crushed like grain between the millstones. Besides, Captain Len Guy could no longer ascertain his position, either in latitude or longitude. The sun being absent, calculations by the position of the stars was too complicated. It was impossible to take altitudes, and the Paracuta abandoned herself to the action of the current, which invariably bore us northward, as the compass indicated. By keeping the reckoning of its medium speed, however, we concluded that on the 27th of March our boat was between the 69th and the 68th parallels, that is to say, some 70 miles only from the Antarctic Circle. Ah, if no obstacle to the course of our perilous navigation had existed, if passage between this inner sea of the southern zone and the waters of the Pacific Ocean had been certain, the Paracuta might have reached the extreme limit of the austral seas in a few days. But a few hundred miles more to sail, and the iceberg barrier would confront us with its immovable rampart, and unless a passage could be found, we should be obliged to go round it either by the east or by the west. Once cleared indeed. Ah, once cleared, we should be in a frail craft upon the terrible Pacific Ocean, at the period of the year when its tempests rage with redoubled fury and strong ships dread the might of its waves. We were determined not to think of this. Heaven would come to our aid, We should be picked up by some ship. This the boatswain asserted confidently, and we were bound to believe the boatswain. For 6 entire days, until the 2nd of April, the Paracuta held her course among the ice barrier, whose crest was profiled at an altitude of between 700 and 800 feet above the level of the sea. The extremities were not visible either on the east or the west, and if our boat did not find an open passage, we could not clear it. By a most fortunate chance, a passage was found on the above-mentioned date, and attempted, amid 1,000 risks. Yes, we required all the zeal, skill, and courage of our men and their chiefs to accomplish such a task. At last we were in the South Pacific waters, but our boat had suffered severely in getting through, and it had sprung more than one leak. We were kept busy in bailing out the water, which also came in from above. The breeze was gentle, the sea more calm than we could have hoped, and the real danger did not lie in the risks of navigation. No, it arose from the fact that not a ship was visible in these waters, not a whaler was to be seen on the fishing grounds. At the beginning of April, these places are forsaken, and we arrived some weeks too late. We learned afterwards that had we arrived a little sooner, we should have met the vessels of the American expedition. In fact, on the 1st of February, by 95 degrees 50 letter 2B9 longitude and degrees 17 letter 2B9 latitude, Lieutenant Wilkes was still exploring these seas in one of his ships, the Vincennes, after having discovered a long extent of coast stretching from east to west. On the approach of the bad season, he returned to Hobart Town, in Tasmania. The same year, the expedition of the French captain Dumont d'Urville, which started in 1838, discovered Adelie Land in 66 degrees 30 letter 2B9 latitude and degrees 21 letter 2B9 east longitude, and Clary Coast in 64 degrees 30 letter 2B9 and degrees 54 letter 2B9. Their campaign having ended with these important discoveries, the Astrolabe and the Zelly left the Antarctic Ocean and returned to Hobart Town. None of these ships then were in those waters, so that, when our nutshell Paracuta was alone on a lone sea beyond the ice barrier, we were bound to believe that it was no longer possible we could be saved. We were 1,500 miles away from the nearest land, and winter was a month old. Hurliguerly himself was obliged to acknowledge the last fortunate chance upon which he had counted had failed us. On the 6th of April, we were at the end of our resources. The sea began to threaten, the boat seemed likely to be swallowed up in the angry waves. "A ship!" cried the boatswain, and on the instant we made out a vessel about 4 miles to the northeast, beneath the mist which had suddenly risen. Signals were made, signals were perceived. The ship lowered her largest boat and sent it to our rescue. This ship was the Tasman, an American three-master, from Charlestown, where we were received with eager welcome and cordiality. The captain treated my companions as though they had been his own countrymen. The Tasman had come from the Falkland Islands, where the captain had learned that 7 months previously, the American schooner Halbrane had gone to the southern seas in search of the shipwrecked people of the Jane. But as the season advanced, the schooner not having reappeared, she was given up for lost in the Antarctic regions. 15 days after our rescue, the Tasman disembarked the survivors of the crew of the 2 schooners at Melbourne, and it was there that our men were paid the sums they had so hardly earned, and so well deserved. We then learned from maps that the Paracuta had debouched into the Pacific from the land called Clary by Dumont d'Urville, and the land called Fabricia, which was discovered in 1838 by Bellany. Thus terminated this adventurous and extraordinary expedition, which cost, alas, too many victims. Our final word is that, although the chances and the necessities of our voyage carried us farther towards the South Pole than those who preceded us, although we actually did pass beyond the axial point of the terrestrial globe, discoveries of great value still remain to be made in those waters. Arthur Pym, the hero whom Edgar Poe has made so famous, has shown the way. It is for others to follow him and to wrest the last Antarctic mystery from the Sphinx of the ice realm. The end. End of the voyage extraordinaire.